My name is Isla. I'm 32 years old. And 2 months ago, on the night of my parents' 35th wedding anniversary, in front of 50 relatives and friends, my mother pressed a crumpled $2 lottery ticket into my palm, while my sister Beatrice was still clutching the check for $25,000 they'd just handed her. For a cruise. First class. My mother's voice was bright and carrying, the kind of voice designed to be heard across a crowded room. This is all that is appropriate for your situation, Isla. They laughed. Every single one of them. They didn't know that little slip of paper was about to change everything. $150 million changes everything, but not in the way you might think. Before I tell you how I dismantled their world, let me take you back to that night. The night the Crawford family's carefully constructed stage finally gave way beneath them. I retreated to the kitchen. The heavy oak door muffled the sound of Beatrice's high-pitched giggling and Julian's booming, performative laugh, that fake rich laugh I'd been hearing for years. The kind of laugh that had never once been aimed at something genuinely funny. The kitchen smelled of burnt rosemary and the faint antiseptic scent of the wipes I always carry in my bag. Nurse's habit. Grandma Grace was sitting at the small breakfast nook, alone, away from the 50 guests celebrating in the next room. She looked small, shrunken. Her eyes were fixed on a spot on the wall, her hands resting limp in her lap, as though someone had simply set her there and walked away. "Hey, Grandma," I whispered, kneeling beside her. She didn't blink. My chest tightened with a familiar ache, the kind that had lived behind my ribs for most of my life. I knew this feeling well. It was the feeling of being the one who noticed. While Beatrice was busy being the golden child, posting influencer photos of her brunch, while our parents quietly siphoned Grandma's savings to fund her followers and her wardrobe, I was the one working double shifts in the pediatric unit. I was the one who had, 3 years ago, handed over $18,000 of my own savings to clear the back taxes on this very house when my parents told me they were short on cash. I found out later they weren't short on cash. They had simply decided Beatrice's old car was embarrassing, and bought her a new one instead. They used my sacrifice to fund her vanity, and they never said a word to me about it because they assumed I would never find out. They thought I was too independent to notice. That was their code word for the child they could ignore without guilt. But here's what they never understood about nurses. We are trained to read the body's quiet emergencies, the ones no one else sees coming. I looked at Grandma Grace and felt my clinical mind click into place over the ache in my chest. Her skin felt like cold parchment. Her pulse was thready and uneven under my thumb. Her pupils were pinpoints. Her breathing was shallow. This wasn't age. This wasn't fatigue. I'd seen this before. "Just a second, Grandma. I've got you," I said softly. I reached into my bag and pulled out a clean specimen cup from my shift, along with a few diagnostic swabs. I worked quickly and quietly, while 50 people clinked their champagne glasses 20 feet away. My gut told me what I was dealing with. I needed the confirmation. I walked back into the living room wearing the same invisible daughter mask I'd worn for 3 decades. My parents were fumbling with their iPads, trying to set up a photo-sharing app for the cruise. Tech illiterate and irritable about it. "I can help with that," I said. Julian, Beatrice's husband, the man my parents worshipped as a financial genius, handed me his phone with a condescending pat on the shoulder. "Thanks, Isla. At least the nursing degree taught you how to follow simple instructions. Right?" He turned back to his drink. My mother laughed. I had 120 seconds. I didn't just set up the app. I navigated to the settings, enabled location sharing to a number he didn't recognize, and mirrored his message backups to a private cloud account. I worked fast. I had practiced for exactly this kind of window. It's what trauma nursing does to you. You learn to do critical work in the margins of chaos. I was about to hand the phone back when a message notification flashed across the screen from a contact named Vinny. "The deed is recorded. The shark gets the house if the first installment isn't in my hand by the 15th. Make sure the old lady stays quiet." My blood went cold. I finished the setup. I handed Julian his phone with a polite smile. I said goodnight to the room. I walked to my car. I sat in the dark for a long time, the $2 ticket in my lap. I want to be honest with you about what I felt in that moment, because it wasn't what I expected. I didn't feel powerful. I didn't feel like some avenging heroine in a movie. I felt sick, genuinely sick. The kind of nausea that comes when you realize something you'd been half hoping wasn't true is exactly as bad as you feared. They had been drugging her. They had used Grandma's post-surgery pain medication to keep her sedated and compliant, while Julian guided her hand to sign the house over as collateral for his debts. The woman who had braided my hair and taught me to bake bread was sitting alone in a kitchen, barely conscious, while her family toasted champagne 20 feet away. For a moment, I almost cried, and I hated myself for it because I knew if I started, I might not be able to do what needed to be done. I looked at the lottery ticket in my lap. Then I opened the app. I scanned the numbers. 1, 2, 3. All 6 matched. I didn't scream. I didn't breathe. A strange stillness fell over me, the same stillness that comes in the middle of a resuscitation, when everything slows down and your hands just know what to do. $150 million. I sat in the dark until my phone screen timed out. Then I put the car in reverse and drove to Grandma's house, the one that was no longer legally hers, and I slept on her couch so she wouldn't be alone. The next morning, I went to see Thomas Smith. Thomas was my grandfather's oldest friend. He was the kind of man who still wore a pocket square, still remembered the names of your children from 3 years ago, and had spent 40 years practicing law with a moral code so firm you could build a house on it. He had watched me grow up. He had watched what my family did to me. He had never once said, "I told you so." I laid the drug test results from Grandma's sample on his desk, next to the screenshots from Julian's phone. "They sedated her," I said. "They used benzodiazepines to keep her incoherent, while Julian recorded a deed of trust against the house. He's using it as collateral with a loan shark named Vinny." Thomas was quiet for a long moment. He read the messages slowly, the way he read everything, without rushing, without performing. Then he set them down. "This is elder abuse and grand larceny, Isla. If we go to the police today, Julian may panic and move assets offshore. He has ties we'd have trouble tracing quickly." "I know," I said. "I don't want him to panic. I want him to get on that ship." Thomas looked at me. Then a slow, steady nod. "Then we don't sue yet. We file a lis pendens, a notice of pending litigation against the property. It doesn't take the house back today, but it freezes the title completely. Julian can't sell it. Vinny can't seize it. The house becomes legally untouchable until the case is resolved." "Do it," I said. Over the next 3 days, I watched them pack through the synced photos on Julian's cloud. Beatrice posted a picture of her designer luggage with the caption, "Finally leaving the stress behind. Blessed." I looked at it for a while. Then I closed the app and went back to work. They were walking onto a ship they thought was their reward. They had no idea it was a cage. On day 3 of the cruise, Julian's sign and sale card was declined at the blackjack table. The dealer returned it with a quiet, professional shake of her head. "I'm sorry, sir." Then came the intercom call to the stateroom. The $25,000 transaction used to fund the trip had been flagged by the bank after I filed a fraud affidavit the morning the ship entered international waters. The credit line was frozen. The account was under investigation. They were stranded on a 5-star liner without access to a single dollar, unable to buy water, unable to pay gratuities, unable to explain to each other exactly how this was happening. That was when I called. I was sitting in Grandma Grace's favorite armchair, the one Beatrice used to call that smelly old thing when the call connected. The house was quiet around me. The grandfather clock ticked. Grandma was asleep in the next room, finally off the sedatives, her breathing deep, and even for the first time in months, their faces filled my screen. They were crowded in a corner of the ship's lounge, disheveled, panicked, nothing like the triumphant family who had laughed at me 6 days ago. Beatrice's mascara had tracked down her cheeks. My mother was gripping her pearl necklace so hard I thought the strand would break. "Isla." "Thank God." My mother's voice cracked. "The cards aren't working. It's some kind of glitch. Julian says, it's a technical error. We need you to wire $10,000 to the purser right now. We are being humiliated." I let the silence sit for a moment. Then, "It's not a glitch, Mom." Julian shouldered forward, his face a mottled, furious red. "Don't play games, Isla. I know you're jealous, but what you're doing is illegal. You are interfering with a private financial arrangement." "Julian," I said, my voice dropping into the tone I use for the most difficult conversations in the ICU, calm, clear, impossible to misread. "What's illegal is sedating a 90-year-old woman to forge her signature on a deed of trust." I shared my screen. The first image was the lab report toxic benzodiazepine levels in Grandma's blood, drawn the night of the party. The second was Julian's location history, placing him at a motel in the city on 17 separate occasions over 4 months during the same dates Beatrice believed he was at business conferences. The third was the lis pendens filing. Beatrice made a sound I've never heard from a human being before or since. Julian's eyes went to the floor. "The house is locked," I said. "The bank has opened a criminal fraud investigation into the $25,000. Thomas Smith is at the district attorney's office right now." I paused. "I won $150 million on that ticket you gave me, Mom." I watched the color leave her face the way it leaves a patient's face when the news is the worst kind. She seemed to shrink inside herself, all the performance dissolving at once until what was left was just a frightened old woman who had made catastrophic choices. "I'm not spending a single dollar of it to save you," I said quietly. "I'm using it to make sure you never set foot in this house again." I didn't wait for the response. I ended the call and set the phone face down on the armchair's arm. For the first time in 32 years, the room was completely, peacefully silent. The ship docked 3 days later. There were no private cars waiting for them. There were 2 officers from the Port Authority and a process server Thomas had arranged. I watched the footage from my new apartment. I'd changed the locks and installed cameras before they boarded the ship. As Beatrice pounded on the front door of a house she no longer had any claim to, calling my name in a voice that had lost all of its old cruelty and become something rawer and smaller, Julian stood at the curb with his head in his hands. I turned off the feed and made tea. A week later, my mother called from a number I didn't recognize. Her voice was thick and wet. "Isla, please. Julian misled us. We didn't know how bad it was. We are your parents. We're sleeping in a motel. It's cold. And Beatrice is struggling so badly. Please, just talk to us. I want to be honest with you again here." For a second, the old instinct flickered. The one that had spent 32 years trying to fix things, trying to earn my place, trying to believe that if I just gave enough, eventually they would see me. I almost believed her, and I hated myself for almost believing her because that instinct was the same one they had exploited my entire life. I agreed to meet them for coffee, to hear them out. When I arrived at the diner, they weren't alone. They had a lawyer with them, a sharp-eyed man who smelled of desperation and contingency fees. They slid a document across the table before I had even sat down properly. "A family trust," my father said, trying to project authority into a voice that had lost its footing. "For tax protection. You need to manage this money properly. Isla, sign this. We'll drop any claims to the lottery, and we can find a way to be a family again." I picked up the document and read it. It was not a trust. It was a total power of attorney. Every asset, every account, signed over to them. They hadn't driven to that diner to apologize. They had come to make one last play. They still thought I was the spare. I set the document down. I took a folder from my bag and placed it in front of Julian. "I have a counteroffer." It was a structured settlement agreement prepared by Thomas. I explained that I was placing $10 million into a managed fund for their living expenses, to be administered by Julian as the managing partner. Julian's eyes lit up. He could not help himself. He reached for the pen before I had even finished speaking. The moment the ink dried, I stood up. "Julian, that trust is now legally attached to your personal Social Security number. And because you just commingled those funds with the assets you stole from Grandma Grace, the IRS has full jurisdiction over every account connected to your name." I leaned in close enough that the lawyer at the end of the table couldn't hear. "I didn't buy your debt, Julian. I reported it. Thomas and I have been working with the IRS whistleblower office for 3 weeks. They were waiting for you to sign a document voluntarily claiming ownership of those assets." I straightened up. "I hope you look good in orange." I walked out of the diner without looking back. 10 minutes later, Julian was in handcuffs on the sidewalk. Beatrice stood beside the seized designer handbag that had cost more than most people's monthly rent, watching the life she had built on her mother's cruelty and her husband's fraud collapse into the pavement around her feet. My phone showed 79 missed calls before I blocked the number. I felt the weight lift off my shoulders so completely it was almost physical, like setting down a bag I had been carrying so long I'd forgotten I was holding it. The aftermath was thorough. Julian was sentenced to 9 years in federal prison for money laundering, tax evasion, and elderly exploitation. He was ordered to pay $342,000 in restitution. Every asset he'd ever used to perform wealth, the watches, the leased car, the offshore accounts was seized. Beatrice's fall was faster and more public. The influencer who had lived for approval became a pariah overnight. When the story broke that she had stood by and benefited, while her husband kept her own grandmother sedated, 300,000 followers vanished in 48 hours. Brand deals were canceled before the ship had even docked. She found work at a dry cleaner. Last I heard, she was doing fine, in a quieter way. I genuinely hope that's true. I hold no anger for her anymore. Just distance. 3 months later, a letter arrived at my new address. My mother's handwriting, on cheap notebook paper. "Isla, I am still your mother. We are old, and your father's back is failing. You have millions of dollars. How can you sleep at night knowing we are struggling? Please, for the sake of family, forgive us." I read it twice. I waited for the guilt. The old, familiar tug. It didn't come. I walked to the kitchen, fed it through the shredder, and watched it become confetti. The silence in my house was not lonely. It was the most peaceful silence I had ever known. My family looks different now. Thomas comes by every Sunday with a fresh loaf of sourdough bread, and stories about my grandfather that make me feel like I am still connected to something solid and good. My colleagues from the unit come for dinner on Thursdays. They know my name. They respect my hands and my judgment. They make me laugh until my sides ache. And I have Grandma Grace. This afternoon, we sat in her garden, the one I used to weed as a teenager, while Beatrice took selfies on the porch. Grandma's mind is sharp again. Her laugh is loud. She held my hand and told me she always knew. "I always knew you were the strong one, Isla," she said. I just couldn't say it loud enough. I am sitting on the porch now, watching the sun move down through the trees. And I want to speak to you directly. Blood does not make you family. Loyalty does. Love does. Showing up does. You are allowed to walk away from people who hurt you, even if you share their last name. There is no moral obligation to remain a target for people simply because they are written into your DNA. They mocked my life as a nurse. They thought it was small. They thought I was small. They forgot what nurses actually are. People who have learned to sit in crisis without flinching. To watch. And wait. And act with precision. While everyone around them panics. To find the quiet emergency that no one else noticed. And handle it with steady hands. My superpower was never the money. The money was just a tool. My superpower was patience. And the knowledge that some debts, the ones written in cruelty and silence and years of being invisible, collect interest. I am Isla Crawford. I am 33 years old. And I am finally, completely, irreversibly free. If this story moved you, I'd love to hear your thoughts. And if you've ever been the spare in your own family, the one who shows up, gives everything, and gets handed a $2 ticket, I want you to know. You are not what they told you you were. Not even close.